I'm David Baumgarten. Well, I have so much to say about the role of Hollywood Boulevard in my life that I just will say switch and go to a different track, much as I did as a kid with my Lionel electric train, which had a great set of switches. It is 1996 as I write this, and I've just bought a senior price ticket at Grauman's Chinese Theater and paid $4.50. I'm amazed. A ticket to this beautiful old opera house of a movie theater costs less than to the storefront theaters in the San Fernando Valley shopping malls. Even the popcorn is cheaper. They call it Man's Chinese Theater these days. Imagine calling the famous painting Starry Night after the person who bought it. Of course, this is a matinee. I always loved matinees. I am alone, as I often was on Hollywood Boulevard. After the movie, I'll drift down the street to Musso and Frank Grill for my martinis and think of the years on this world-famous street and play the dangerous game of nostalgia. Switch. The year is 1949. The war is over at last, and the streets are fully lit again. The red car trolley travels from Van Nuys in the San Fernando Valley to Hollywood in about 25 minutes. My mother is working at Barker Brothers Furniture Store on Hollywood Boulevard, next to the Paramount Theater and catty corner from the Chinese. I am 13. It is Saturday for certain. Barker Brothers has a small record department. I look for the latest Mario Lanza 78 RPM record. I walk to my favorite movie theaters. First I go by the Egyptian on the south side of the street. It shows the MGM musicals. A year ago, I saw The Wizard of Oz here in its first re-release. I love the fact the movie started out in brown and white and then switched to incredible Technicolor when Dorothy landed in Oz, and then back again when she woke up in Kansas. My dad explained the name of that brown and white process as sepia tone. The Egyptian was my favorite theater, and even in those days, MGM was my favorite studio. I later learned that the Egyptian theater, like the Chinese, was also the dream child of Sid Grauman. My favorite movie of all times is Singing in the Rain, about the transition of movies from silent to sound, and I saw it at the Egyptian, of course. It was here that I first saw Gene Kelly, Judy Garland, Katherine Grayson, Jane Powell, and Debbie Reynolds. Next year, I would see Betty Hutton and Howard Keel in Annie Get Your Gun. Betty Hutton movies usually played the Paramount Theater. She was pretty and funny at the same time. Now I cross the street and backtrack to Pickwick Bookstore, an awesome place with great ladders on rollers reaching upwards at least 3 stories. I thumb through the books about movie stars and find one that has a picture from Meet Me in St. Louis, an article about Margaret O'Brien, my first screen love. I leave and walk east 6 or 7 blocks on the north side of the boulevard. I walk past an old restaurant called Musso and Frank until I get to the Warner's Theater. A white-bearded man in a frontier hat and coat approaches me with a smile. He gives me a card. It says, "William F. Cody at your service." I often see him walking on the boulevard. There are many funny-looking people whom I recognize every time I come to Hollywood. I knew the man wasn't the real Buffalo Bill, although he certainly did look like him. When I reached the theater, Romance on the High Seas is playing. I'll come back next week and see it. In those days, the major studios either owned theaters or exclusively released their pictures to them. I bet you can guess who owned this one. I'd first seen Robin Hood with Errol Flynn here, and lots of black and white musicals with Dennis Morgan and Jack Carson. I never went to see Betty Davis or Humphrey Bogart, although I knew who they were. I crossed the street to the magic store. I always went there, although I seldom purchased anything. My dad had told me about seeing Houdini. A magician named Blackstone once came to my elementary school. I liked music better. Still, I loved the magic shop. Don't take away magic. Switch. The cold condensation drips down the side of my second martini. At 13 or so, I found some other interests on the boulevard. One was a magazine store several blocks east of Vine Street on the north side. In it was a whole roll of nudist magazines, not easily seen from the front of the store and stapled shut. I can't remember how I bought one, but I guess my money was as good as the next fellow's. Sunshine and Health was the name on the cover. I kept it for several years hidden in some messy drawer of mine. My drawers were indeed messy. I don't know what happened to the little envelope I had with a gold nugget from the Klondike, but I never lost the magazine or the memory of its airbrushed genitals. The multitude of female breasts were left intact. Almost across the street from the magazine store was a movie theater devoted to edgy foreign films. By edgy, I mean salacious. I went once to see French White Cargo, which had a shower scene showing naked women. It was very exciting to this 13-year-old who was never questioned at the box office or door. However, I didn't spend too much time pursuing interest on the east side of Hollywood Blvd, because I had another interest close by. I would walk south on Vine for a few blocks to Sunset Boulevard, to what I called Radio Land. At Vine and Sunset Boulevard, there was the most marvelous green Art Deco building. Today, some sort of historical society would have been able to save it. Of course, I never heard the term Art Deco until I was in my 50s. The huge letters on the side said NBC. I think they called it the Blue Network in those days. Turn left for 2 blocks, and there was a much colder-looking tan building with KNX written on the front. It was the Los Angeles radio outlet for CBS. That network wasn't identified by a color. Further east on Sunset sat the studio of local radio station KMPC, where my parents' close friend Benny Lagasse was music director. Somewhere close on Vine Street were the ABC and Mutual Network studios. I attended live radio shows at all these studios from the time I was 10 till the early days of television. I even got to be a contestant on several quiz shows. I can't remember the name of one slick host of a daytime show, but I attended the show so often that I knew his warm-up pitch by heart. One day I sat in the front row and mouthed along with him, or said it in a whisper. He noticed and kicked me in the shin. I stopped abruptly. He must have felt guilty because he picked me to be a contestant, and lo and behold, I answered the showbiz-related questions perfectly and won a small raft of gifts. I remember the sponsor was Halo Shampoo. I got a supply for that hay flu hair of yours, as the host sent me back to my seat. That reminds me of latchkey games my friend Terry and I used to play at home. We'd call random people from the telephone book. I had the lowest voice, so I pretended to be a quiz show host and asked a simple question. If my victim answered correctly, I said, "Congratulations, you've won a Kelvinator garbage disposal and a year's supply of garbage." I hung up quickly. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Jack Bailey was the famous host of A Queen for a Day, which was a long-running radio show. It was broadcast from the Earl Carroll Theater on Sunset. Bailey was trying out a new quiz show in the same venue. I attended and ended up on the giant stage as a contestant. I won a certificate for an ice cream cake, which my mother redeemed happily on me and my dad's July 13th birthday. Programs were often transcribed in those days, so I heard them both at the studio and later on the radio. I was thrilled. My greatest pleasure came from attending the live radio shows of The Red Skelton Show and Eve Arden's Our Miss Brooks. Yes, they were radio shows up until the early 50s when they migrated to TV. But let's stick with my friend the radio for a while. What more can be said of Red Skelton than has already been said? He warmed up the audience with a 20-minute pre-show. He came out holding up a set of keys and shouted, "Attention, did anyone lose a set of car keys? My secretary, Helen Hunt, just handed them to me. So if anyone lost a set of car keys, go to Helen Hunt for it." Get it? Helen Hunt. Yuck, yuck, yuck. But when Red Skelton said it, you had to peel the audience off the ceiling. When the 30-minute broadcast was over, Red stayed there on the stage, took out a bottle, and proceeded to do his hilarious vaudeville guzzler's gin routine. 40 minutes later, the audience poured out onto Vine Street. What a free show that was. I saw it many times. And he played real good for free, sang Joni Mitchell in the 60s. It is 1978, Seattle. I take my 7-year-old daughter, Lisa, to see Margaret O'Brien in a revival of The Secret Garden. For some reason, there was a drawing for prizes. Lisa won 2 tickets to attend the second performance of the Red Skelton Show at the downtown Paramount, an old-time vaudeville house, an early Seattle movie palace. Skelton, long after his radio and television career, had taken to doing occasional live theatrical performances. How fortunate, I thought, I could introduce my daughter to the unparalleled talents of Red Skelton. The show started at 10:30 p.m. The tickets were for the second performance. We stood in line for about 30 minutes to get into the giant theater. Bravely, Lisa stood while rubbing her eyes. We had only fair seats. Suddenly, at 10:40 p.m., somebody with graying red hair burst through the curtains and shouted, "Attention! Did anybody lose a set of car keys?" Lisa was asleep in my arms. Our Miss Brooks was different than the Red Skelton Show. It was a situation comedy about a school teacher and her students. The deadpan delivery of one-liners by Eve Arden was augmented by a cast of professionals, all of which went on to become famous in television and the movies. Richard Crenna was the prize student. Gail Gordon was the principal, and especially Jeff Chandler as Mr. Boynton, the co-teacher and love interest. Chandler was famous already. A Universal Studio contract player who made lots of adventure and costume films. I was pleased and surprised to see the young but gray-haired actor still showing up in the last days of the radio sitcom. The rest of the cast went on to the television recreation. Jeff Chandler did not. Paul Newman was cast in the film version of Leon Uris's epic novel about the establishment of the nation of Israel, Exodus. Jeff Chandler desperately wanted to play the character of Dove and was more right for the part than Paul Newman. Sadly, Jeff Chandler died soon after during an operation for a back problem that should have been a slam dunk. I was saddened, but a little proud of having seen him in person with a script in his hand as a radio player. He might have gone on to be a truly great film actor. The year was 1952. There were two magical events taking place on Hollywood Blvd. I bought a ticket to the world premiere of Arch Oboler's The Devil, the first commercial 3D movie, and the first in a long line of second-rate movies shot in the stereoscopic process, requiring the audience to wear polarized glasses. The process was fun, with spears aimed out at the audience, but even my 16-year-old taste knew the film was terrible. Down the street, at the Warner Theater, something much more magical and revolutionary was taking place. It was a roller coaster ride of a film called This is Cinerama. It ultimately transformed the way movies are made, just as the advent of color and sound did for earlier generations. For those who don't remember, the Cinerama process was shown on a huge curved screen. 3 separate projectors running in synchronization produced a super-wide panoramic view, wrapping the audience in sight and 6-channel stereophonic sound. It took 5 technicians to keep it running. The memory of it is breathtaking. First, there was a small black and white image with news commentator and adventurer Lowell Thomas telling the history of moving images from ancient times to the first movies. It was a complete and well-made documentary. Then he warned us to the impending revolution in filmmaking. This is Cinerama. There was a loud squeaking sound of steel wheels on rail. The huge curtains began to open and never seemed to stop. And suddenly, we were on a roller coaster climbing the first hill with real screams emanating from the theater. It was thrilling and a more theatrical movie experience than anything I've ever seen since. The rest of the film was a superbly made travelogue taking us to the canals of Venice, the La Scala Opera House, a castle in Scotland, and after an hour and a half, a scenic flight in a small plane across the entire United States with daring dives through the Grand Canyon and under the Golden Gate Bridge. The sound and music were overwhelming. I'll never forget the singing of the Salt Lake Tabernacle Choir singing America the Beautiful. I guess old Lowell wouldn't say Mormon in those days. It turned out he was an investor in the Cinerama process. The super movie was a giant hit in 1952, and there were many imitators. Michael Todd was involved. You remember him. He was one of Elizabeth Taylor's most loved husbands. So the revolution got started. Todd decided that they didn't need 3 projectors and 5 technicians to do the fabulous wraparound effect of Cinerama. Just create new lenses and use a wider film stock, almost twice the size of the 35mm normally used. And of course, a giant curved screen. So Todd bolted the Cinerama Corporation and asked the American Optical Company to create the lenses. Voila! Magic again. He called the process Todd A.O. Never quite as effective as Cinerama, it was still quite marvelous. Now, Michael, what to do with it? Why don't you tempt Rodgers and Hammerstein to convert their stage masterpiece Oklahoma to be the first Todd A.O. film? Todd, apparently a very persuasive fellow, succeeded. The film opened on Hollywood Boulevard at the Egyptian, newly outfitted to accommodate the giant screen and 70mm projectors. I saw it during the first week of its almost year-long run. Meanwhile, promoter Todd was borrowing and stealing to get his film Around the World in 80 Days made to further demonstrate his process. It opened in Los Angeles soon after Oklahoma, but not on Hollywood Boulevard. Instead, it played at the fabulous old Carthay Circle Theater, the venue for many great and experimental films, including Fantasia, Snow White, and Portrait of Jenny. The two films, Oklahoma and Around the World in 80 Days, were huge successes and ushered in a whole new era of theatrical films trying to lure moviegoers from their newly acquired television. The Cinerama Corporation went on to produce 5 or 6 travelogues before teaming with MGM for 2 fictitious films, The World of the Brothers Grimm and the stupendous How the West Was Won. It was the last film to use the triple lens and triple projector process that I call the real Cinerama. Early on in the process race, Darryl F. Zanuck, production chief of 20th Century Fox, searched for a standard 35mm process to install in thousands of theaters that couldn't handle the huge screens, but still wanted the participation effect of an extremely wide screen. He produced the first CinemaScope film, The Robe, a religious epic that debuted on the newly installed screen of Grauman's Chinese, with the stereo sound reduced to 3 speakers behind the screen and 1 surround set installed on the side walls and behind the audience. All of this is fascinating to me because I inherited the interest in the mechanical side of film photography and projection from my father, who gave me a real 8mm electric projector when I was 5. Of course, it didn't have stereophonic sound. It didn't have sound at all, so I would synchronize my wind-up Victrola to play classical music with my cartoons and military marches with my World War II newsreels of the Battle of Midway, courtesy of Castle Films. The stereoscopic 3D process did produce some good films: House of Wax, Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder, and MGM's Kiss Me Kate. Walt Disney, always the pioneer, produced a 3D cartoon and one in CinemaScope. CinemaScope, which won the process race, was installed in thousands of theaters and led to imitations such as Superscope or WarnerScope, VistaVision, and eventually the standard of the film industry, 35mm Panavision. Single-lens Cinerama, Ultra Panavision, came along in time for Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey and Stanley Kramer's It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World. What a roller coaster of a ride they all were. Once, over a Musso and Frank's martini, I tried to list them all from memory. I did very well according to a list of widescreen films I obtained from a new book on the subject. Still, nothing seemed as wonderful to me as that first dramatic curtain pull and Lowell Thomas' voice shouting,
"This is Cinerama."
During the 60s and 70s, I didn't visit my boulevard very often. It fell into disrepair, and many of the theaters and businesses closed. It became a downright scary place at night, badly lit and unsavory characters replacing the once charming people. It took the establishment of the Hollywood Walk of Fame to gradually revive interest in the old street. The Hollywood Chamber of Commerce and honorary mayor Johnny Grant resurrected it after much hassling with the city of Los Angeles and a general lack of financing. But their enthusiasm and the support of the movie and recording industries finally won the day. And now crowds of tourists make it almost impossible for me to walk my boulevard. Still, I love it. Should I order a third martini? I remembered someone saying about martinis, the third one will get you. And maybe nostalgia too. Anyway, I love this street. I paid my bill and walked out the door into the early evening.
When my time is arrived and the shadows of yesterday, schemes of a lesser day are gone, and I wake in the dawn, having dreams of tomorrow's song, ships and sails to carry me on. And here as you lie by my side, we dream of a finer time together, our brighter spring of rainbows, and you touch me now. Hear the sea breezes cry, hear voices of yesterday, lost in a better day and find. And you lie there asleep, I wonder if our love can keep till we've come to live in our time. Yes, I tasted you there. I wondered if you one day care, even though we only have a start. I run half in fear,